Yo, 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 yo. Mm, mm, mm. What up, what up, what up, what up? I see the avatar jump in, so we must be in my seat. What's up, y'all family? How y'all doing, man? This is brother Lawrence. Whoever's in that 228. Yep. And we're gonna get right into it. We're gonna pick up where we left off yesterday, man. I had to go handle something and kind of cut the show short. And we're gonna pick. Well, I'm not gonna pick up. Just in case. Um, you're tuning in for the first time. We are talking about First Nation people, right? And I'll pull up the stream right quick.
Governor's Teaching Fellow.
All right, you're gonna reintroduce. We're gonna reintroduce the speaker, interviewer.
We're talking with Valdosta State University professor Dr. Dixie Haggard. He was recently selected in 2019 as a Governor's Teaching Fellow for the Summer Symposium program offered through the Institute of Higher Education at the University of Georgia. Dr. Haggard, a professor of history, was one of 18 professors from across the state chosen for the program after a highly competitive application and selection process. One Valdosta State University professor, Dr. Dixie Haggard, is working tirelessly to help the Native American tribe gain federal recognition.
Okay, and they're talking about the Pascagoula River tribe, and I did a few vids on them, so more about them. You're gonna get more in detail, but we want to pick up where we left off, and basically, the Pascagoula River tribe helped. When the French first arrived to the coast, right, to the Americas, right, and they met the Pascagoula, okay, and the Pascagoula uh, 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 pretty much and the Pascagoula pretty much brought them around to all the other the neighboring tribes, right, and from there be able to carry them into Mobile. You know what I'm saying? Right. And so this is where we left off at. Here is we was about a good 9 minutes. I know we left off at the red stick
from the plantations on the south, and so you actually really Central Florida and North Florida, and that created what we and so that people forget how to deal with certain things. They forget cultural ceremonies and cultural processes, but they also they forget economic practices and subsistence patterns. Some things can be lost. And Seminoles are a good example down here. They didn't exist at the time of Columbus. The Seminoles are a created tribe, or created, we shouldn't use the word tribe, created nation out of several collapses of several different chiefdoms, specifically people coming out of South and Central Georgia, some coming out of Florida and Central Florida and North Florida, and that created what we tend to call the Seminoles today. And we need to keep in mind there's actually several different groups of Seminoles. There's the Miccosukee Seminoles, which are mostly based in North Florida, Central Florida, and Georgia, South Georgia, the descendants of those people that were there. And then there's the Muskogee Seminoles, which are Red Stick Creeks that left Alabama after the Red Stick War, 1813 to 1815, and they fled to Florida. They allied with each other. There was some intermarrying, and they knew each other. Culturally, there were similarities, but they were very different ethnically. And then we can't forget the Black Seminoles, because there were lots of runaway slaves. There were slaves that were taken away from the plantations on the South. And so you actually really have three different groups down there that we all lump and call Seminoles, but there's really three different ethnicities down there in Florida. And they start out in North Florida and get pushed down into South Florida by advancing by U.S. troops and by the frontier. So the Seminoles themselves, so those two, the Miccosukes and the Muskogees, Seminoles are descended from multiple different chiefdoms that existed in 1492.
Talk to me now about how the idea for removal, the forced removal, came into play.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning of the United States. The United States, as it's developing its policy towards Native Americans, there is actually a debate between the states and the federal government who has jurisdiction with Indians within state boundaries. And under the Articles of Confederation and under the Constitution, the federal government was pushing the idea that Native Americans fell under their jurisdiction, not state jurisdiction. So there's actually a power play in the early U.S. period. And under Washington, they developed what they called the Civilization Plan. And the goal there was to, again, like I said a while ago, civilize the Indians, teach them the ways of European Americans or Anglo-Americans, and hopefully then they would give up all the excess land. In the Southeast, that didn't happen. Native people paid attention to what they were teaching them and understood the values. They took in what the government was willing to give them, but they started creating organized governments to resist this encroachment. Okay. Now, as far as the United States is concerned, the Civilization Plan failed. They couldn't, in the Southeast, it's a matter of they learned, hey, this land has value. We're just going to do what you're telling us to do. We're going to farm the way you want instead of the way we've done it. But they started things to whites, but they weren't going to give up the land. The same thing occurred in the Great Lakes area. They pretty much learned what was going on. And in the United States, Western Europe and the United States, there's actually an intellectual shift from the Age of Enlightenment, where there's a focus on rationalism and there's a belief that all humans have the same basic abilities and what have you, towards the Romantic era, the Romanticism, which really embraces the natural order of things and irrationality. And it's a reaction to the Enlightenment era. The founding fathers created the country under enlightened principles. And Romanticism actually embraces a natural order, and it moves into the direction of more racist attitudes. And so what you have is the founding fathers. You talk about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and eventually James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. They kind of embraced that enlightened Native Americans. You get Andrew Jackson, who comes along, who's really embracing this romanticized attitude that they're an inferior group of people, and that the Anglo-Saxon race needs to, control everything because we know what to do with the land better than they know what to do with the land, that type of thing. So there is an intellectual change in the way Americans look at the world. The other thing that happens is Thomas Jefferson in 1803, with the Louisiana Purchase, realized civilization's not working. This is when he comes up with the idea for voluntary removal. In other words, we should probably get the natives in the East to move west of the Mississippi. And if they'll do that, they'll have more time to, quote, civilize out there and not be confronted by the negative aspects of the frontier east of the Mississippi. And so Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Adams all kind of followed this voluntary removal process. And then Andrew Jackson, partially because of Western farmers, people that want that land in the Great Lakes area, and definitely in the Southeast, which is some of the best farmland in the interior. And the argument is these people are inferior. They're not using the land adequately. We're the superior race. We should move them out west. And so that's where your idea for forced removal comes from.
See,
There is an
they
intellectual
telling you.
change, at least as far as
They telling you what it is. They telling you what it is. Straight up.
definitely in the southeast, which is some of the best farmland in the interior. And the argument is these people are inferior. They're not using the land adequately. We're the superior race. We should move them out west. And so that's where your idea for forced removal comes from. There is an intellectual change, at least as far as the leadership of the country is those that are educated. And if you start looking at the grassroots kind of perspective, there's all these farmers and plantation owners that want that land. And in the Northwest, it opens up huge amounts of wheat production. In the Deep South, this helps reinvigorate slavery and the spread of cotton into the interior, into Alabama, into Mississippi, Western Georgia too.
Talk to me now about what we know commonly as the Trail of Tears.
Well, the Trail of Tears specifically is what the Cherokees call theirs. It's the trail where they call it. It's the trail where they cried. It's Nuna Do'otsuni is how they pronounce it. I think I got that right. The Trail of Tears. This is it begins with the Indian Removal Act, and technically the Indian Removal Act doesn't do anything. Jackson gets it passed. The goal is to remove the Indians to the west. It can't actually force the Indians to go to the west because we're in the United States government's in the process of negotiating treaties with them. So to get them to remove, we have to get them to agree to treaties. In the case of the Cherokees, there's the first court case that brings this up is Cherokee versus Georgia. The state of Georgia had extended its law.
Yo, Mr. Haggard, he breaking it down.
There's the first court case that brings this up is Cherokee versus Georgia. The state of Georgia had extended its laws into the Cherokee Nation, and the Supreme Court actually ruled that the Cherokees couldn't sue, that they were not an independent nation, they were a domestic dependent nation within that court case. But Georgia then passed laws that would stop missionaries from coming into the Cherokee Nation to help them, because a lot of these missionaries were helping them resist the encroachment of Georgia and taking over the land. And so a group of missionaries did it anyway. They didn't get permission from the state of Georgia. They were arrested, and the leader of these, Worcester, sues the state of Georgia, saying you don't have jurisdiction in the Cherokee Nation. And that's where the Supreme Court steps in and says, sides with the Cherokee Nation. It says, yeah, they're a domestic dependent nation, but they have internal sovereignty within their nation, and only the federal government can actually negotiate with them. The state of Georgia cannot extend its laws until the federal government actually extends its control through treaty process into that territory. So, and the state of Georgia has started lotteries giving away Cherokee land in violation of this. And this is the famous quote where Jackson said, John Marshall's made his ruling, let him enforce it, which would have been an impeachable offense, by the way. He should have been impeached for that. This leads where a group of Cherokees who had been leaders but were no longer in the elected government of the Cherokee Nation were signed a treaty, because they had come to the conclusion that get the best deal you can. They signed a treaty with the federal government, and the actual government of the Cherokees did not sign this treaty. John Ross, the principal chief, he didn't sign that treaty. And so the treaty party that did sign the treaty made a deal with the government, got out and moved west, and actually had a very easy time doing it. John Ross resisted, and the Treaty of New Echota is in 1835. They finally get removed on the Trail of Tears in 1838. 5,000 people died on the trail, okay? That doesn't count the people that died in the concentration camps before they went on the trail. So the government went in and herded these people up and put them in these fortifications that are, in essence, concentration camps. And they were kept there. So disease started running through these people during that period. And then they were broken up into multiple parties and sent on a 1,200-mile trek to Oklahoma. The other thing is that 5,000 death toll doesn't actually count the number of people that died in Oklahoma after the Trail of Tears. And so during the Trail of Tears itself, 1/4 of the nation died. Okay. But more than that died before and after the fact. And then you have to consider there's a lower birth rate as a result of this. So this is another demographic collapse. And this goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning, was the policies of the United States, even though it wasn't deliberately trying to kill off people, they caused this to happen. The removal, some people apply. It's mostly appropriate for the Cherokees. It's not like the other groups didn't suffer, but the Cherokees are the ones that came up with that term.
Most definitely, because you got the Choctaw people that was along that Trail of Tears as well.
The Choctaws were the first to
Damn, I just spoke too early.
Get removed.
I need to have a little bit more patience.
To the southeast, they signed the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1832.
Right.
They had significant losses. The Creeks lost at least a third of their nation during the process. And the thing with the Creeks is they were removed from Georgia, and nothing was really done with those people. So a lot of those people just moved into Alabama. Some went to Oklahoma, but most went into Alabama, created a demographic collapse and spread of disease and other issues because they couldn't feed everybody and take care of everybody. Springs was signed where they were forced to give away land, and the Creeks complained, said this wasn't our legitimate leadership. And actually, John Quincy Adams, the president, renegotiated the Treaty of Washington in 1826, which actually kind of ended part of that process. The governor of Georgia at the time, George Troup, went with the Treaty of Indian Springs and just started forcing everybody to be removed. The Creek leader that was trying to resist that, Apophle Yahola. Then, several years later, you get the Treaty of Cusseta, which is in 1832, which is the removal of the Creeks, in Alabama, and that's where you really start getting this huge demographic collapse. But so there's kind of this rolling wave with the Creeks that's much worse than what, on some level than what you have with the Cherokees. The Seminoles, the Treaty of Payne's Landing was their, quote, removal treaty up for, and that launched a war with the Second Seminole War with the United States from 1832 to 1842, and massive amounts of devastation. In the end, there's the core groups that are still in Florida, the Miccosukee Seminole tribe and the Muskogee Seminole tribe of Florida. Those that are two federal recognized tribes today are descended from those people that stayed behind and never got removed. So that's the removal process in the Southeast. The same thing's kind of taking place up in the Great Lakes. The Potawatomi had their Trail of Death, what they call it. This was a specific group of people led by Chief Menominee. The Potawatomis were more, there was like multiple bands, so they weren't as organized as the Southeastern groups were. And Menominee didn't sign the removal treaty that took place in 1830. Series of Potawatomi leaders signing different treaties over time. And Menominee didn't sign the treaty, but the government came in, brought in troops, and there was 859 members of his band, and they marched them from Twin Lakes, Indiana to eastern Kansas. And they had a high death rate too, as far as part of that's concerned. So, what's happening in the Southeast didn't just happen in the Southeast. It happened in the Great Lakes area. And just to take it one step farther, we could talk about the Navajo Long Walk, which took place a half a century later, 1864 to 1866. There's a series of Navajo wars where the government's fighting the Navajo. They don't really want the land. They're not really on land that the government wants at the time. There's not a lot of settlers clamoring to go into that land, but there's various fighting and several wars. Eventually, they forced them to march 450 miles to Bosque Redondo, which is a reservation. It's in a desert. It's an awful place. And they're there for about 4 years. And eventually they beg them and let them go back. And eventually they let them march back to their homeland. And I think in the process, they moved about 9,000 people. But if you actually look at the wars they fought before this and what happens to all the people that died at Bosque Redondo, you're looking at possibly as many, starting at 25,000 people alive at the beginning of the Navajo Wars. By the time you get done with everybody, the long walk of people going back home, you're down to maybe about 5,000 people. So another huge demographic collapse. Yes, the wars they were trying, the government was killing people, but it was more of a trying to conquer them and put them where they want them. And then the long walk, none of this was a deliberate genocide. There wasn't a deliberate Holocaust, but it had genocidal impact in the number of people that died. So I do want to clarify a distinct plan. Oh, we're going to kill Indians. The goal here was to get what the government wanted, which from the very beginning, from the beginning of the United States until 1933, acquire the land and acquire the resources on the land over and over again. And after they're on reservations under the Dawes Allotment Act, the government starts actually allotting out land to other people. The government, after they put them on reservations, starting really in the late 1840s, and started creating reservations, the people weren't, quote, civilizing. They weren't assimilating to the Anglo-American way of doing things. And they decided this is because they held the land together as a tribe or as a nation. And so in 1887, Congress came up with the Dawes Act, which says, okay, we're going to take the land from the tribe and we're going to give it out to individual individual plots. We're going to teach them greed. And the argument is we're going to kill the Indian, but save the man. That's literally the slogan for the time period. Kill the Indian, save the man. They're going to teach them the value of land. And lo and behold, they go in and survey the land. The Dawes Commission surveys the land across the board. And then when they're done, there's always surplus land. Who gets the surplus land? White settlers, okay? And I don't know if you ever saw Far and Away, the movie with Tom Cruise in it. And if you, at the very end of the movie, they got people lined up. They're getting ready to come across into settle Oklahoma. That's Indian land, okay? And that's where you get the boomer sooner from. The boomers are the people that lined up, and when they boomed the cannon, they ran across and they grabbed their plots that were surveyed out. The Sooners were the people that snuck in. And so Oklahoma, the University of Oklahoma, celebrates the taking of Indian land with their song Boomer Sooners. Sooners. So when you look at even that scenario, the government can't get enough, and there gets to be a point where, in giving the land away to individual Indians or Native people, they're looking at them and saying, okay, you're not doing what you're supposed to, or there are people that don't know what to do with the land, and they lose the land because they don't know how to pay taxes on the land, or they don't have, or they get swindled out of the land. And then they actually have an act that's called the Dead Indian Act. What do you do if somebody dies before they've proven that they can convert the land constructively? Because when they gave the land out, they gave them 25 years to prove that they could work the land, improve the land, and then they got citizenship as citizens of the United States government. That they got to vote in elections and among other things. And what do you do if somebody dies before they've proven this and improved the land? Who gets the land? Does it go? No, we got the Dead Indian Act. We're going to give it away to other white people. Okay, so over and over and over again, from the beginning of 1776 to 1933, U.S. government policy is trying to find a way to acquire the land. One of the goals there is we're going to civilize or assimilate Native Americans, kill the Indians, save the man. And that has devastating impact. That's why the demographic collapse kept continuing after the United States came in. And so
one of my favorite reads, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee.
D. Brown, yes.
The Nez Perce and Chief Joseph. Talk to me about what happened with the Nez Perce.
Well, the Nez Perce, they lived, I think it's the Wallala Valley. I think that's the name of the valley. Beautiful area. They loved it, but they were starting, there was lots of white, and they wanted the land. And so they wanted to put them on a reservation, and they wanted to give them up. And Chief Joseph refused to give up the land. And eventually there's a skirmish broke out, some whites die. And so they realized that, the government's going to come in And they went, I think it's like a 1,200, 1,300 mile journey trying to escape to Canada. They went east and then went north on the plains to try to join Sitting Bull in Canada, because Sitting Bull had fled the plains to go into Canada. It wouldn't have really helped them very much had they gotten there, because Sitting Bull eventually had to come back because they weren't used to the weather. The Canadian government wasn't any better in the way they treated them than the United States government. And so it wouldn't have worked out. But it's a very tragic story because they actually outfight 3 different U.S. armies. They outsmart them and outfight them. It's just, the problem was they couldn't defeat the communication. And right before they crossed it's a very tragic story. He's very poetic in his descriptions. I will fight no more. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. Very poetic in the way he expresses it, and you kind of get the sentiment of what was being taken away from him.
We hear a lot about the psychic impact of African slavery on African Americans today. Talk to me about the psychic impact of First Nation people having gone through all of that, and the life as we see, for the most part, on reservations today.
Well, you've got several things that affect this. Let's go back to what we're talking about. Disease, the collapse, the demographic collapse that continues after they're on to after World War II, that we actually see a demographic recovery. I think the number's in a couple million now of Native Americans. Okay. So it's not till then we start seeing a recovery. So that right there has an impact, because there's generation after generation after generation that remembers people just dying. The other thing is, I have friends that are on reservations, and they tell me that they have treaties with the government where the government's supposed to provide food or some kind of resources for them to survive on the reservation. Because most Native tribes did not fight the U.S. government. Most tribes sided with the government in the Indian Wars. And a lot of tribes didn't do any fighting. And the government came in, they signed treaties. Well, what are we supposed to do if we give up this land? Oh, we'll take care of you. We'll educate your children. We'll do this. And they put them on reservations. The problem with the reservations was they were poorly managed. They usually got very poor food. When the food rations come in, they don't know what's going to come in. One year you might get a ton of cheese because the government spent extra money buying up cheese on the market to keep that market up. Another year you might get a ton of beans, and they don't know what they're going to get from one year to the next. Second thing is, you're a defeated people. You're forced in here, and it's also, you're kind of, for most of the 19th and most of the 20th century, you really can't leave the reservation unless you have permission from the agents. And you can't really do anything on the reservation unless you have permission from the agents. So that in and of itself is oppressive. They're the first people. They're the first group of people I call the "I want less government" people, because they by the time you got to the 20th century, they were tired of somebody from the federal government, from the Indian office, saying you have to do this.
Peace to you, Chico. Tuning in from North Las. Oh, gotta get out to Las Vegas. I think I've been through Vegas one time on my way to LA. I was born in LA, right? Actually, Torrance, which UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. You know what I'm saying? And I had the pleasure of taking that trip, which really wasn't. It wasn't no pleasure in that trip. It was no pleasure in that trip. 2 days in the truck. But we had to come through Las Vegas, though. I sure remember that, man. But peace to you, and I appreciate you tuning in. Hope you're enjoying the bill.
You have to do that. You have to do that. And that was just beating on them. So you have this period of Indian warfare, which, again, I want to reemphasize this. Most Native Americans did not fight the United States government, but it still had. Grandfathers talk about this, your grandmothers talk about this, and it gets told over and over again. Then there's the tribes that have the long walk, that have the trail of death, that have the trail of tears. And that's told over and over and over again. And it's part of the psyche, it's part of the impact of what's happening. And then if you start to watch movies, and there's a lot of people my age and your age who grew up watching these westerns where who is the bad guy? I actually teach a class on the Hollywood Indian, how Hollywood has portrayed Native Americans through the 20th century. And a lot of kids thought, oh, Indians are bad. I'm not supposed to be an Indian. I'm supposed to give up my culture. A lot of that's kind of, we get a message out in the majority culture of what the West was about. They got the same message that they are less than. And so again, it's something that's beating on them. And then you have, so the late 19th and 20th century, a lot of Native children sent off to boarding schools. And the ones that weren't sent to boarding schools went to day schools. And over again, until you get to 1933, the Indian New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, up to that point in time, they didn't teach Indian culture. They taught them basic reading and writing and arithmetic, and taught them vocational skills so that they could work in the homes of white people or work in businesses for white people, mainly as laborers. Okay, and they're told their language isn't any good. They're the small children. They can't come in, and if you speak your language, you're beaten. I work at Haskell Indian Nations University, which started out as a boarding school, and they had these little rooms built into every building. Whereas if you spoke your language or you got out, you didn't do what the people told you to do, they locked you in that room for hours on end. They even all had their own Indian jail, where if you spent two problems, and I put you in there. And these are children we're talking about. We're not talking about adults. We're talking about children. They had this thing called the Haskell collar for those that had propensity to run away. They wanted them to be able to work but not be able to run away. So it was a horse collar they put around them, and it had chains that went to their hands and their feet. And so they could do farm work at the reservation or at the boarding school, but they couldn't run away. And so that's part of the process. And a lot of these kids went off to these boarding schools and never came home. So a lot of them died there. Haskell has a cemetery at the edge of the campus where a lot of the kids died in the 1919 flu epidemic. In fact, when I was in Kansas, I worked the 2 years I worked there in the early 2000s. They had discovered there was a dump down near the river. They discovered some bones in the dump. It turns out that was sick. They knew they were going to die from the flu, and they didn't want to die on the I should call it reservation, but on the boarding school. They didn't want that to go on their numbers, so they took them off campus, so they would die off campus. And then they didn't just give them a decent burial; they just burned their bones, burned their bodies down at the dump, and then just left them down there. So this adds up over time. Okay, you have generation after generation after generation being told what to do. You're getting this media. A lot of people question, well, why are Native people
being conditioned?
Upset about,
don't forget that,
mascot names or what have you. These things denigrate Native Americans, and it's over and over again. Your culture isn't valuable. We'll take what we want from your culture that we like the Indians, wearing, having tomahawks and doing this, doing that. But we're not going to really give you the whole culture as a whole. That should actually explain that to you. We're just going to pick and choose what we want, and we're going to dress up like Native people. We're going to do what we want to do, and Hollywood has perpetuated that image too. And so this all just pounds on Native people as you go through time, and that's for recognized tribes and unrecognized tribes. The group that I'm working with in Mississippi, the Pascagoula River Tribe, they have suffered the same psychic issues. They have issues with being isolated, and in their case, they weren't even allowed to claim they were Native. They were just, oh, you're something less than, and pushed off to the side. They were played off the African American community during segregation. There was an Indian school that they had to go to, but it wasn't called an Indian school; it was called a Creole school. Because if they called them Native Americans, they might owe them something. And then they had the African American school, and then you had the white school. And the Native Americans couldn't go to the African American school, and they couldn't go to the white school. The African American school could go to the 12th grade. The they could only go to the 8th grade because Native Americans didn't need an education beyond the 8th grade. The African American school went to the 12th grade because the African American community made sure they had the resources to do that. It's a bigger community, had more economic resources. So Jim Crow pounded on African Americans, but it also in the South pounded on Native Americans too.
The work that you're doing with the tribe, the Pascagoula tribe, what all does that involve? What all does that entail?
It's one of the most complicated things I have ever done in my entire life, and it probably will be my life's work. I'm hoping we're going to be done soon. I'm writing a report for the tribal council that it's a petition to the federal government to grant them acknowledgement. Again, on some level, this is asking the federal government to recolonize them, but and I explained this when I started working with them in 2013.
Hey, he funny, sleek, but honest at the same time.
Entire life, and it probably will be my life's work. I'm hoping we're going to be done soon. I'm writing a report for the tribal council that it's a petition to the federal government to grant them acknowledgement. Again, on some level, this is asking the federal government to recolonize them, but and I explained this to them when I started working with them in 2013. But they need this because they've been so heavily discriminated against, and they don't have that ability to pull the resources together because of the way they've been abused. And if they get recognition, the government will help them. Not so much giving out handouts, because the government doesn't actually give out money, but they would be able to organize to get grants. They would from affairs. But it requires, I have to show that they are descended from a historic tribe, which is the Pascagoula tribe. I have to show that they've had a functioning government of some type, which can change over time, since 1900. I have to show that they have social institutions since 1900. We have to show that a majority of the tribe.
Since 1900. You don't have to go back that far. You ain't got to go back to the 1800s. The man finna put a whole tribe on the map, changing their whole situation. And they ain't got to go back past 1900s.
Lives within a certain area of whatever the homeland is, that there's we have to show that a majority of the tribe is genealogically descended from a historic tribe. And that's very complicated because you're dealing with a very small group of people that were off to the side. They didn't get removed during the Trail of Tears or the removal period. They just were off to the side because they were so small. The whites around them knew they were Indians, but the federal government didn't interact with them. The other thing was, for this group, they're over there in southeast Mississippi, Jackson County, and other Harrison County is the next county over. Those are the two primary counties, but today they're in the 6 lower counties of Mississippi. But they are in I lost my train of thought there. Where they're located, they were kind of isolated from everything else, but we need to show that there's a concentration in those 2 places. And it's hard to do. And we have to, each individual person has to supply birth certificates, marriage records, that type of thing. And we have to track the entire tribe to show that they've been there. It's a very, very, very complicated process.
And this process is called acknowledgement.
Yes, it's called acknowledgement.
Just for the sake of being acknowledged for who I am, what I am, and where I came from, this process becomes so involved when one would think it's a very simple matter on the surface, but it's not.
No, it's not. And you talk about the psychic impact. This group has that added psychic impact of the majority culture around them telling them, you're not Indian. You're something less than. You're people. You're not really Indian. You're not of value. And during the segregation period up to '68, they were put in their own school, which is very inferior compared to the education of what the white students were getting. And some, they didn't even have an adequate transportation to get them to the school. And it's hard to track. And this is, like I said, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done. With the federal government, they have a set of criteria, but they actually tell you can do it whatever way you want to do it. But they have a set of criteria that you have to meet to prove that they are Native American. And then the crazy thing about this is when you talk about this identity, you're actually asking the government to tell you you are what you say you are. And in and of itself, that's a hard thing to think about. If you really, I don't have that problem. I am who I am, and nobody's okay. Yeah, I have to prove a driver's license. I go to vote. I have to show I have to show my ID, that kind of stuff. But on a whole, there's no questioning who I am and my heritage, and it's taken at face value. The people I'm working with, in some cases, no, you're not.
Yeah, it's taken at face value. Let's run that back.
You're asking the government to tell you you are what you say you are. And in and of itself, that's a hard thing to think about. If you really, I don't have that problem. I am who I am, and nobody questions me. Okay. Yeah, I have to prove a driver's license. I go to vote. I have to show I have to show my ID, that kind of stuff. But on a whole, there's no questioning who I am and my heritage, and it's taken at face value. The people I'm working with, in some cases, no, you're not. They're just told you're not. You're just less than, and that has continued up to the present day. That hasn't actually gone away. And so this is actually one of the things about the South that's, we tend to think of the South, if we start to talk about ethnicity and race, we tend to think of it black and white, okay? But in the South, there are these other people, and there are Native people out there. There's also,
these are the other people. There are other people out there.
we don't tend to, we start to think of it more. There's more people, Hispanic people down here than in the past, but there's always been that presence here. But we've also had some other communities here in the South. It's not just black and white. That's the numbers. But there's these other people that are out here. And I would argue that the South is different from the rest of the nation because of this.
Say that again, bro.
There's always been that presence here. But we've also had some other communities here in the South. It's not just black and white. That's the numbers. But there's these other people that are out here. And I would argue that the South is different from the rest of the nation because of this. This is the one place where 3 continents came into sustained contact, and it's still there. You have Africa, you have Europe, and you have North America. And those cultures are what make the coming together of those cultures are what makes the South different. And if you travel outside the South, people outside the South, they'll talk, the first thing I always talk about is our accent, but they'll talk about how we're strange. We are different. And yes, we are. And there's a reason for that. That's the thing we should probably embrace.
On the one hand, society calls me a mongrel, while the federal government have to prove to the federal government that I actually exist. I'm a mongrel on the left, and my very existence is questioned on the right.
Mm-hmm. We have a very, and this is a complicated history. And I actually try to explain this to students and move through who we are. I actually go back to the foundation of this country. I argue that when the first settlers showed up in 1607, the first English settlers, because the English did this different from the French and the Spaniards. The French and the Spaniards had use for the Native Americans, the First Nations people. The English didn't. What they wanted was the land, okay? And in 1607, from that point on, just get the Indians off the land, okay? 1619, you have your first Africans brought in. Why? To work the land. Now, slavery does and they were enslaved on the ship that they were brought in, but some of them probably became indentured servants. We don't know. There's not a good record there. But by 1660, the House of Burgesses, the state legislature or the colonial legislature for Virginia, started institutionalizing slavery.
Yeah, we're gonna run that back. You know, he's saying that some of them slaves, don't know if they majority rule that might be indentured servants. What?
Become institutionalized right away. In fact, a lot of those first Africans brought in, they were enslaved on the ship that they were brought in, but some of them probably became indentured servants. We don't know. There's not a good record there. But by 16 or the colonial legislature for Virginia started institutionalizing slavery, organizing it around the principle of if your mother is of African descent, then you're African, and they started putting slave around color and ethnicity, that type of thing. And they institutionalized. I argued they invented racism then. And the goal even then was to separate indentured servants, poor whites, from people of African descent, because the problem there is they were starting to marry and start to have children. And so they had to separate this out. They had to create something. But what was it about? It was about working the land. At the same time, 1659, Virginia started sending Indians from the Great Lakes area that they had armed into Georgia to seize Indians and bring back enslaved. And the men slaves, and the women were kept on the plantations in a lot of cases. And that's where a lot starting in Virginia, you start having a lot of African men children with African women. Now the birth rate's not very high because there's a high death rate, but that's the beginning of that. That's again this blending of our cultures that makes the South different. But from the very, very beginning, it's always been about that. By the time we get to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where in England they throw out the James II, and bring in William and Mary, John Locke defends this, and he talks about we all have inalienable rights: the right to our life, the right to our liberty, and the right to the property we accumulate. And Thomas Jefferson reiterated that in the Declaration of Independence. We have a right, our inalienable rights, our natural right by God, or natural rights by nature, right to our life, right to our liberty, and a right to pursue happiness, because they don't want to look like they were promising property, but to protect property. And if you look at the Constitution, that those things are centered in the Constitution. But I would argue that throughout the history of the United States, and going back to the English colonial period, we've always placed property in front of life and liberty. You can't have slavery if you if you value life and liberty over property. You can't remove Native Americans, and you can't put Native Americans on reservations if you don't value property over life and liberty. And I would argue that's a cornerstone of the debates we've had all the way up to the present day. We've valued property over life and liberty.
Casinos, blessings, or curses?
They are a little bit of both. There are tribes that make a lot of money. There are tribes that don't make a lot of money off of them. In Oklahoma, they're not. You almost have to have one because everybody else has one. But there's so many casinos, they don't really make a lot of money. The Cherokees in North Carolina and the Poarch Creek in Alabama do really, really well. The Cherokees, the last time I talked to some of them, they were given $7,000 or $8,000 a year to individual members of the tribe. They're able to employ most of the tribe, and that's a nice little supplement on top. If you have a job, that's not a bad supplement on top of it. The Poarch Creek actually were able to do a little bit better. They're able to give out, and they actually. One of the former chiefs gave me a tour of the reservation. He pointed out that they debated about it. They decided if they had the money, they would go up to 20 supplement on top of it. And they actually have, I think, 100% employment with their tribe. They actually have to hire out. They're actually a major employer. The Cherokee Nation and the Porch Creek are the Eastern Band of Cherokee and the Porch Creek are both major employers of non-natives in their respective areas. So in those cases, the very huge benefits because those tribes, number one, they don't have competition from a lot of other tribes where they are, and they've had good leadership. I had another friend that was a member of a tribe up in Minnesota, and they tore themselves up about talking about casinos and what have you. He said it ended up being a trailer with some slot machines, and they couldn't get anybody to come because they weren't on the beaten path. There wasn't a nearby urban, population that was willing to travel to gamble where they were. So they have issues. The Pascagoula River tribe hasn't decided yet what they're going to do, if they're going to do anything. They're not really. Their goal is they want to be recognized for who and what they are. Casino is something else that maybe or may not. A good chunk of the tribe are members of holiness churches that they created themselves, and they don't believe in that. So that's a point of debate for them. And I don't know how much money they would make because the Gulf Coast has tons of casinos down there already. So I don't know how they would build a casino. But that's not my bailiwick.
Yeah, well, my dad's creek, right, and it's the creeks in Atmore, Alabama, right. I haven't really tracked down the name and the details of that instead of ongoing process, but that's the word in my family. They got a casino too, so that's how that stuff be.
As far as helping them, that's their decision making when they get acknowledgement. So I would argue that it has a mixed bag. There's some negative, and there's some positive.
Dr. Dixie Haggard, history professor at Valdosta State University. I thank you for our class today.
Thank you. I thank you for having me.
You have a great day.
You too. Take care.
Yeah. So that was the end of that. And man, I thought it was a powerful bill, man. A lot of information dropped, a lot of basic stuff we need to get back to drop, and it's up there. So I appreciate everybody tuned in. I don't think I have any too many people tuned in to open the panel. So we're going to go ahead and end this thing. I appreciate y'all. Make sure y'all hit that like button, right? And, as always, man, you find out who you people are by doing genealogy, right? So that's what this whole journey is about. We're going to get back to the genealogy builds and probably come try to get some of these genealogists on a panel, man, and see how that rocks out, man. But until next time, peace and blessings to all of y'all, my family. We out this thing. Peace.